Our feature guest headed into the Amazon jungle in Brazil 30 years ago as a missionary to bring the Bible to the remote tribal Pirahãs people. Confronted by lives and concepts so different from his own, American Daniel Everett lost his religious faith, indeed even his family, and then found himself in the middle of a major intellectual row, having challenged the basic tenets of the language theories of Noam Chomsky, no less. This tiny tribe has no creation or afterlife story. It recalls no history beyond 25 years, has no concept of left and right, and an obscure language that lacks a fundamental characteristic that, according to Chomsky's theories, underlies all human language. Well, his encounter with them changed Daniel Everett's life, and the Illinois State University academic now fears their encounter with outside cultures could change theirs. He's the author of Don't Sleep, There Are Snakes. Daniel Everett joins us now from Illinois. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
So you grew up in the South, in the States. Were you raised in a religious family? What was the world of a child there?
Well, I was actually raised in Southern California, about 8 miles from the Mexican border, and my family wasn't religious at all. But when I got to high school, I met a young woman who became my wife, and she was very religious and had in fact been raised in the Amazon by missionary parents.
And was it at that point then that this was your introduction, if you like, to a religious faith?
That's right. I was the typical rock and roll playing, drug-using California teenager of the 1960s and came into contact with religion, and it sounded like something that was quite different and very unusual, and the idea of being a missionary and living a very different life appealed to me quite a bit.
Would you say that you were a genuine believer in those days, that when you went to the Amazon you really believed in your faith and that you were off to save lost souls?
Oh, absolutely. My conversion was very genuine. I went to the Moody Bible Institute in Chicago, Illinois, a very conservative evangelical Bible school, and I preached on the streets of Chicago and in rescue missions of the Salvation Army, and I converted many people to the Christian faith and graduated #1 in my class and became an ordained minister. So my conversion was very real and very profound and very important to me for a number of years.
And this isn't a person then living out a life, so to speak. It is genuinely very powerfully held, which is important to establish, really, when you think about what happens next.
That's right. I mean, many people have heard, me talk about some of the influence that the Pirahãs have had on me and tried to say, well, you were never Christian to begin with, or your concept of Christianity was quite different from the normal, but I really don't think it was. It was profound to me. I got up and prayed every morning. I read my Bible daily. I read the Bible in Greek. And so I partook of a spiritual life that meant everything to me for over a decade.
Meeting your wife and the Christian conversion that followed was also in some ways your introduction to the peoples of the Amazon, because her family had a history of missionary work there.
That's right. I would spend time at her home, and her father, who is still a very charismatic person, would talk about his incredible experiences in the Amazon, show me slides and sound files or recordings that he had, and this just appealed to me. I was just incredibly enthralled with the exotic life that he had led, and I wanted to have something like that for myself.
So when you were sent to the Amazon, fired up with this faith, what was your brief, so to speak? What was your mission?
Well, we had been asked if we would be willing to work with the Pirahã people because other missionaries had tried and failed to understand their language and make headway in converting them to Christianity. So we were assigned to them. We accepted that assignment with pleasure. No challenge was too great for us, we felt, and our job was to learn the language, translate the Bible, and leave a church of Pirahã happy and content in their religious faith before we left.
Going there, was it anticipation or trepidation that you felt?
It was a combination of both. On the one hand, I was extremely excited to be going finally to my life's work, to meet these people that I believed God had led me to, and that I would be responsible for them in a very important spiritual sense. But on the other hand, I was afraid. I was afraid of not being able to learn the language. I was afraid that no one would be converted. I was afraid of failure in a number of ways. And I was also afraid of what it might do to the health of my family, what might become of my children. So there were a number of reasons to have mixed feelings, and I had the whole gamut of emotions, I suppose.
How old were your children when you headed off there?
Well, my youngest was 9 months old, my middle daughter was 3 years old, and my oldest child was 6 years old when we landed in the village for the first time.
And how remote are we talking? What is the scene that confronts you when you arrive there?
Well, they're by river. They're at least a week from the closest town or settlement of Brazilians. So you really are completely isolated. You only hear Pirahã. There's no electricity. There's nothing but the jungle and the river in front of your house, and you're on your own. In the first years, we were prohibited by Brazilian law from even having a radio to contact the outside world. So we spent, for example, almost the entire year of 1980 with no electricity and no contact with the outside world, no mail, no news of what was going on. And it was quite a change when we came out after a full year in the village.
You're going in there with a 9-month-old baby. You must have, in those first days of arrival, thought, "What am I doing here?"
It was a very great challenge for us. But my wife, remember, had been raised in the Amazon, so for her, this was what you did with your family. And I sort of followed her example to some degree. But we had faith that God was leading us and that He was in charge. And so, if it hadn't been for that faith, I don't know if I had been going down just as an anthropologist, if I would have taken my family, or just as a linguist. But as a missionary, I felt that the children would have a role to play, and it was important for them to be part of what I was doing.
What contact had the people that you were with, the village that you were with, had with any outside cultures or visitors before you arrived?
Well, the Pirahã were first contacted in the 1700s, so they had seen outsiders, we know, for over 300 years on an occasional basis. During the Brazil nut season, when the water's high and there are lots of Brazil nuts around the Pirahã, traders come in to get the Brazil nuts, and they exchange things like coffee and milk, or mainly whiskey, with the Pirahã to get Brazil nuts. But they had also, in 1959, a missionary with the same mission I went with entered the village and lived with them for 8 years. And after that, another missionary from the same mission entered in 1967 and lived there until 1976. So they had had quite a bit of contact with the outside world and with other missionaries before we got there.
That said, they are, as a society, as a people, very different from anything you had encountered before. What is the life that they live there, and indeed the different understandings and worldviews to which you were introduced?
Well, one of the most astounding things about the Pirahã, for everyone who knows them, even the Indian agency employees who ask me about why they're so different, is their complete rejection of the outside world after so many centuries of contact. Every other group in the area who had lives similar to the Pirahã as late as 50 years ago today have assimilated to a much larger degree into Brazilian society. The Pirahã consider themselves superior to everyone else, frankly. So they not only don't want what we have, they prefer their way of life, which is technologically one of the most primitive on earth. And in their beliefs, which of course took me a long time to understand and to get into, they're also very, very unusual.
How did you begin to make contact with them?
Well, when I landed in the village, we flew in on a plane and used an airstrip that the mission had put there before we went there. And I got off the plane feeling sick to my stomach. I found out that I got airsick very easily. But I was surrounded by these people who were smiling and touching me, and they couldn't have been friendlier. So I started using immediately the linguistic training I had, and I pointed to myself and said, Daniel for my name, and they would give me their names, or at least what I thought were their names. And they showed me a rodent that they were singeing the hair off of in the fire. And I asked, what is that in English? And they told me back in Pirahã, kai ehe au aga. And I wrote that down, and I assumed that meant that's whatever rodent that was right in front of me. And started making progress that way, just with nouns and then a few simple verbs, and building up eventually into a better understanding of the way the sentences work.
The language that you used there sounded to me a little bit like Mandarin. Are there some similarities? It's a tonal language, is it?
That's right. So it's very similar. I mean, it's not very similar to Mandarin, but it's very similar in the sense, in the ways that it uses tones. So every vowel has to have a specific pitch on it. So if I say the word for friend, it's magiai. If I say the word for enemy, it comes out magiai.
I see. Same word, different pitch.
That's right.